Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Grimet with the Bipartisan Policy Center, welcoming you to the conversation we are having this morning on ESG with a focus on what's happening outside of the US. Delighted to start this off with the conversation with our good friend, Doug Peterson. Doug is the CEO of S&P Global. He is also a fan of evidence and collaboration and pragmatism, so he's kind of central casting for here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Doug is currently the chair of our ESG task force, but we've also had a long-standing collaboration, much of it focused on infrastructure. And it was obviously delightful for us both to see this bill finally land with tremendous bipartisan support, at least in the Senate. And I think we'll be spending a lot of time over the next couple of years thinking about the implementation issues. But again, to the discussion today, I have 3 or 4 questions, Doug, just to kind of warm this up. Then I'll turn it over to my colleague, John Sarushian, to lead a panel. And just to level set, next to the letter CRT, ESG is probably the most commonly described, least understood 3 letters in the English language these days. And so it'd be nice just to kind of get us going with your perspective on, what's happening with ESG and, why is it important to the country, but also why is it important to S&P?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jason, for hosting this event and for the collaboration, the partnership for many, many years. And as we were talking offline, the infrastructure bill that was just passed, thank you so much for the leadership and the knowledge that this group presented over the years. And that also is going to link into ESG. But to take a step back, ESG is something that people care about, and they care about it for various reasons. You can't pick up a newspaper now and not read about climate change and the impact that somebody's had from a flood or from a fire. It's hard to see when you read something, you read about the diversity, equity, inclusion movement that's going on. And when you take a step back, people want to know what is in the pool of investments that I'm making. How are the companies that I'm investing in, or the pension that I have my money in, or the insurance company that's investing my insurance money, how are they investing that? What kind of companies are managing those funds or investing in? What's the impact that they have on the climate? How are they managing their company when it comes to diversity? What does their board of directors look like? What kind of practices do they have? And people care about that, especially our employees. In our company, they care about it. Employees across the globe care about these things. And this is something that's really taken on a lot of momentum. I'd say it started in Scandinavia as a process related to financial markets 8, 10, 15 years ago. And in S&P Global, we actually had products that went back as long as 20 years ago. But going to a little bit what's happening in the markets, there's a lot of momentum behind ESG and the sustainable finance field. There are today, this year, there's already been about $130 billion worth of issuance so far this year of debt, which would be called sustainable debt or things like that, which compared to the amount of funding 3 years ago. And anyway, so if you go back, if you look at the amount of financing that's taken place over the years, it's really starting to balloon. Recently, the International Energy Association talked about targets that they need, which would be up to $4 trillion a year to bring the energy field up to what they would call a clean energy to do that transition. And recently in the COP26 in Glasgow, a group of financial institutions got together and formed something called the GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And they talked about $130 trillion of financial resources they're going to make available over the next 20 to 30 years for this kind of a transition. Now, turning to the policy front, if you talk about this ESG space, there's kind of an alphabet soup out there of many different organizations that over the years have been starting to come up with standards, with ratings, with reporting, with disclosure standards, et cetera. Recently, in the EU, they've launched a series of reforms in the sustainable finance space that are really reshaping how the financial and the non-financial firms are going to operate. There's something called the Network for Greening of the Financial System. It's steaming ahead. It's working on sustainability risk. You have the Financial Stability Board, which is made up of the finance ministers and central bankers. They're working on projects. IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Commissioners, they're starting work on things. But most importantly, over the last month, There's an organization called the IFRS, which has always been for the accounting standards, and they've established the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB, which is really valuable because they're going to look at disclosure, and it's a convergence of many different organizations from that alphabet soup that are coming together to come up with standards around disclosure, which then can be used by people to make decisions. As I started off talking about the people that have money in pension funds or in insurance companies or banks, they want to know where that money is. Well, the companies and organizations will have to start doing some sort of disclosure based off of this. Just turning to S&P Global very quickly, we have a three-pronged approach to ESG. One is our own, how we run our own company, our own standards, our own net zero pledges, how we think about our DEI programs. The second is how we think about being involved with policy organizations like the work we do with you, to be with the people that are making the new policies, that are setting up the standards. We want to be there. We want to help with that. And then third, we have a set of products and services. As I mentioned before, going back over 20 years ago when we launched the sustainability indices for Dow Jones. We also bought a company called TrueCost in 2017 that has information on over 15,000 companies' carbon, water, waste usage. And in 2019, we brought a company called Robeco Sam, their corporate sustainability assessment, into S&P Global. I could go on, but this is going to be a great conversation today. I'm so pleased that you've convened this group, and we can learn a lot about what's going on in the EU.
So Doug, let's just dig in there a little. I think the reason we asked you to chair this exercise was really because of S&P's really pretty unique look across not just the economy, but also internationally. And you mentioned the EU a couple of times. The general kind of caricature of the EU is like Brussels is like the most bureaucratic institution, can't get anything done. And yet at the moment, they do seem to be on a number of issues, including data privacy and to some extent ESG kind of leading the discussion. And so I guess the question for this discussion, panel is like, why should we care about the EU? I mean, so great, they're talking about soft cheese and ESG, but what's the relevance to the US?
Well, there's two really important aspects to that relevance. And just first take a step back. And I mentioned that Scandinavia and Northern Europe were where the ESG movement for financial markets really started flourishing. So that means that now across the banks, the central banks, the FSB I mentioned, which is the Financial Stability Board, et cetera, those organizations have started debating what should be the sustainability and ESG factors that get incorporated into decisions that are made around financial allocation of resources and capital. And that goes all the way from private financial institutions to public sector financial allocation. And so there's regulations that have started building up, and they're way ahead of the rest of the world. That doesn't mean that the rest of the world isn't doing things, but let's compare it to the US. Compared to the US, they're way ahead of the US. And so my first point, if you look at the financial institutions that are the largest US financial institutions, so let's take the largest global banks. Most of them are based in the US, and they're global. They operate in Europe, they operate in Asia, they operate in the US. Even if New York might be the center of the capital markets, they have large operations around the globe. And they will be working with the central banks and the regulators in jurisdictions like the EU, and have to start complying with all of those new regulations. In addition to having their clients have expectations that that's how they're going to operate. So if you're a global institution and you have large operations in the EU, you're going to start operating under those standards. And it's important that we think about it from a US point of view, that we need to get involved in also setting our standards, which is my second point. We need to also start accelerating this discussion in the US so that we don't get left behind and either let the Europeans set all the standards, but we really should be at the table and doing it together so that we can think about it. So I think that it's important that we learn from everything going on in the EU. There's been many different discussions about taxonomy, about how they're going to look at disclosure requirements, what they're looking at for benchmarks, what are some of the standards around data disclosure, et cetera. And a lot of these things I'm mentioning are not being discussed in Washington right now.
So let's focus just a minute or two on DC, and then we can turn it over to the panel. One club that is international with our participation is the G7. And my understanding is that actually just earlier this week, the G7 made some announcements about its own intentions around ESG. How relevant does that strike you?
Well, I think it's actually, for me, very valuable that the GC took this on. The GC, which has been led by the UK right now, they've had the presidency until the end of the year. Earlier this year, they convened a group of about 120 experts covering all of the different aspects of markets, NGOs, the big four accounting firms. They brought people from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, from Europe, from North America, and they were bringing these groups together to understand what's happening with ESG, with sustainability, and the ability to link the private sector and the public sector. And there were two working groups. I led the first working group, which was based to really come up with recommendations to simplify and harmonize reporting and methodologies and accounting for transparency and sustainability. And this group was really interesting. We had a sprint. In fact, it was a benefit. There was only 4 months that we had to do this work. It meant we had to move fast. And then the second group was looking at how can you think about actual financial instruments and delivering financial capital to the markets, including SME and small and medium enterprises, and also into the emerging markets. So we presented the work on Monday to the G7 presidency. The report goes through how we can apply recommendations like what I mentioned before, supporting the ISSB and the IFRS so that there's not multiple initiatives going on, that there's convergence instead of divergence in the markets for this kind of ESG data. Looking at ways that companies can voluntarily provide disclosure and what are those best practices around that kind of disclosure. And then, as I mentioned, the link to SMEs and to emerging markets. But the one point that kind of links to the dialogue we've had in the last couple of questions is that the advantage of the G7 is it's not just Europe. It includes the US, it includes Japan, so that you've got other parts of the world. And then we've linked the G7 work to the G20, which then becomes much broader. Next year, the G20 is going to be led by Indonesia, which means that you're getting back to the emerging markets to be part of the dialogue. So having the global standards where you've got the Japanese and other markets around the world involved, the G20 being part of that, this is going to allow us to have much more of a global dialogue around what are the best practices for sustainability.
So Doug, I think my last question, just to kind of drill down a little bit on these United States, folks have probably noticed that Congress is not the most efficient collaborative body these days, but there's one thing that kind of unites all Americans, and that's not wanting to be told what to do by Brussels or worse yet, the French. And so, do you think that that's going to be actually a motivation that could drive this discussion towards a U.S. consensus? And where do you see the administration focusing? There's a lot of, everyone likes voluntary, but do you think we're going to start to see anything that looks more regulatory?
Well, first of all, Kerry has said that he was going to be looking at this beyond what he's been doing with global collaboration on energy transition and sustainability. He's also started talking more and more about the financial markets and disclosure and standards, and that has even said that there would be some standards that would be developed over the next couple of years in conjunction with Janet Yellen and with the SEC. So we expect that there will be work that's coming out, that it will come from directed from the White House, and that the SEC will be involved. As you know, last year the SEC did call for input on climate-related disclosures, and they've said that they've started getting a request for comment about climate-related disclosure, and they've started approaching many companies about their climate disclosure. So I think this will be happening. Now, just as a little bit of background, 85% of the companies in the S&P 500 actually have a sustainability report that they issue today. And in that report, they talk about their climate disclosure, their diversity and inclusion statistics. But what happens is that's not consistent. It's voluntary disclosure. It's more in a narrative format. It's not necessarily usable in the sense of being a data or statistical analysis that you could plug into models and then rating agencies could use, et cetera. And so I think the disclosure dialogue will be valuable so that we can stay on path and stay on the same path in comparison with the EU and the rest of the world. And we can also start delivering the information that people care about. they really care about. As I mentioned before, the nurses and the doctors and the policemen and the firemen and the teachers that have a lot of money in pension funds and pension systems and insurance companies and banks that care about it, and employees in S&P Global that care about this. But I do want to mention one thing, which is in the US, being a very litigious society and a litigious economy, one of the things that a lot of companies worry about is as they start disclosing, will this lead to litigation? And that's something that in Europe and Japan, I don't hear people talking about that. In the US, they do. So there's a lot of discussion about a safe harbor, which would be valuable to have that as be part of the dialogue. So companies that want to disclose don't then want to turn around and get sued about their disclosure. And so that is going to be part of the dialogue in the US as we start looking at the disclosure coming out of the SEC. But net, going back, there's demand for this kind of information. People are excited and enthusiastic about the changes that we're seeing around the globe when it comes to energy transition, the support for changes from a society point of view to ensure that we have an approach to equity in the way we work in the world, of how we can combat some of the inequality that we see around the world. So these are things that people care about. We're going to see them start being reflected in financial markets. And I thank you for everything the BPC is doing to help bring this dialogue and bring it to life in Washington.
Doug, as you know, always enjoy talking to you. We care a lot about trying to move from aspiration to pragmatism. And I think your leadership and just also your willingness to continue to kind of frame the larger discussion for us is really appreciated. So thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Now I want to turn it over to my colleague, John Sarushian, who is going to lead the next panel and probably dig a little deeper on some of the issues that Doug and I discussed. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Jason and Doug, for starting the discussion today. We are now going to turn to our expert panel to further discuss what Europe is doing with ESG and what it means for the US. With that, let me introduce our panel first. So on our panel today, we have Elizabeth Gillum. She is the head of EU Government Relations and Public Policy at Invesco. We have also David Henry Doyle. He is the head of Government Affairs and Public Policy for Europe, Middle East, Africa at S&P Global. And finally, we have Tom Quadman, who is the Executive Vice President for the Center for Capital Market Competitiveness at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin our Q&A, though, I want to tell the audience that you can submit questions using the live chat function on YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. So again, you can use the live chat on YouTube or Facebook to submit questions, or you can use the hashtag BPCLive on Twitter. With that, let me start with our first question, which is for Elizabeth. Elizabeth, at BPC, we generally tailor our events to an American audience that might not be as familiar with the European Union's governance structures. Without necessarily getting into any specific policies, can you tell us what the various institutions involved in ESG issues are at the EU and the role they play? Also, can you tell us how they sort of interact with each other and firms such as your own?
Morning, John, and morning, everyone, and thanks for the question. So, yes, I mean, I know that Jason just said, that Brussels is seen as very bureaucratic, and it can be quite a complex organisation with lots of different players for those who are uninitiated in some of the weird and wonderful ways that the EU works. But broadly, when we're talking about financial services regulation, there are two key main processes that we're interested in. So one is the legislative process. And so here, there are three broadly key institutions that are involved. So firstly, we have the European Commission, which is sort of our executive branch. And they are the ones who propose regulations. So they have the right, what we call the sole right of initiative to put proposals on the table. We then have essentially, so similar to Congress, we have two chambers. So we have the European Parliament, which is directly elected by voters across the EU. Representing all of the 27 member states, and they get to amend and draft legislation. And then we have, so that's sort of, I guess, a little bit akin to your House of Representatives. And then we have sort of, I guess, our version of the Senate, which is the member states. So the national governments all sit in a council and they also get to amend the legislation. And then we have a process similar to sort of your reconciliation where the two come together. We call it trilogues. So all three institutions sit together and come up with the final version.
Great. Thank you. So that's a little.
So we then have the regulatory process. So all the sort of, sorry, I think there's a bit of a delay, time lag there. So I was just going to say, we then got the regulatory process. So this is really where the regulators, again, from all the national institutions come together and draft the really technical rules and actually sort of decide and say how some of the regulation is going to be implemented. I think the really interesting thing to add that's slightly different when we talk about ESG policy, particularly in relation to the taxonomy, is we now have this additional body that's called the Platform for Sustainable Finance. So this is an advisory body that has financial institutions, but also NGOs and industry who sit on this, and they're the ones who've really been opining and helping the European Commission in particular draft some of these very technical rules around sustainable finance to bring that broader perspective outside of just financial services.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. That's an interesting lesson, civics 101, I guess, for the EU. So learned a lot just from that question. And with that, let's turn it to David. So, the topic here is ESG in Europe. What ESG policymaking activities in Europe do you most closely follow? How much coordination is there between sort of European and American policymakers? And do you expect this to change in the coming years? So I guess two-part question. One is, what are you following? And the second part is sort of how the US and EU are collaborating or not collaborating, depending on sort of what you see.
Super. Thanks, John, and thanks for the invitation. I mean, to take the first question first. What are we following? I mean, S&P Global was sort of invited in at the beginning of this to be an advisor to something called the High-Level Expert Group that set a roadmap. 10 key actions back in 2018 for the EU to pursue greening of its financial system, to promote sustainable capital flows. And it's executing on that broad roadmap year by year with various different policy initiatives. And the key thing to keep in mind here, there's a lot going on. And the short answer to your question is you have to follow all of it because it is so interconnected. There is foundational pieces of legislation being introduced, like the EU taxonomy that Elizabeth mentioned, which is kind of the bedrock of how you define what sustainability is. And then building off that, you have sectoral pieces of legislation for financial market participants looking to enhance their disclosure, and for corporates looking to enhance their disclosure as well. And it is challenging. It's challenging to follow, but the EU deserves a lot of credit for launching such an ambitious political agenda on this. We're really interested at S&P Global in the disclosure part of the discussion for two reasons. One, data and disclosure in the sustainability space is a huge obstacle, but a huge opportunity. Doug mentioned the data that we have at the moment on ESG issues is very fragmented. It's not standardized. It's very difficult to analyze efficiently. So it takes people a lot of time to actually prepare that data and analyze it. And we're starting to see people wanting to make strategic decisions in this space. And you can make strategic decisions where you see data converging in a high quality environment. So we really think that's important at S&P Global. We produce something like 135 billion data points every day at S&P Global. We want them to be the highest quality, and getting disclosure right is a big part of that. But we're a big user as well. So we want to have high quality disclosure to use in our credit ratings, our benchmarks, and our ESG products. And we're starting to see momentum change there. You asked your second question on, American policymakers, European policymakers, what are they doing? Is there much coordination? I actually chair something called the Sustainable Finance Task Force at the American Chamber of Commerce, the EU. And the reason we set this up way back in 2017 was because US companies really felt they needed to be at the table. They needed to engage in the EU agenda because they were operating in the EU. And we wanted to help build a system so that we could make sure it was one fit for purpose. And at the time, there was no dialogue on these issues, and there has not been for the last 4 years. And this has meant that the EU system was essentially built in an isolation booth to a certain extent transatlantically. However, that's changing, and there's now dialogue happening, which is fantastic to see. So we're seeing a lot of positive change in the transatlantic space on sustainable finance, and whether that dialogue turns into coordination is really an important question. We think it's vital to have international coordination to avoid fragmentation of the markets, incompatible regulatory regimes. But as Doug mentioned earlier on, the EU has a head start here, and it's essentially built a fairly complex system that American companies, American firms are going to have to comply with. So as the as the US starts to think about how far it wants to go down the ESG policymaking road, we have potential for imbalance, and we have potential for rulemaking to run into conflict. So what that means, personally, I think that should mean that we have even closer dialogue on the path forward to make sure that we have compatible regimes, and that the global challenge of sustainability and climate change can be tackled from both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you, David. So it sounds like there's a lot of moving pieces. And with that, I kind of want to turn it to Tom. Tom, are there any policy issues that you're following especially closely, either ones that David brought up already, or ones you kind of want to introduce and dive deeper into? And sort of what is the thinking of the US business community in general on these issues?
Oh, thanks a lot, John. Good seeing you. And actually good seeing David. We had a conversation on some of this last week, and also want to thank Jason and Doug for really having a very comprehensive overview of this. And sorry, I had some technical issues I was trying to deal with at that time. But look, we learned very early on in the financial crisis that we could have a simultaneous debate going on with different issues on both sides of the Atlantic. And that if we're going to appropriately address those issues for the business community, you have to be engaged in both places at once. And I would even take this a step further. I think ESG is a very good example of that, is that too often the US business community is not involved in the broader global discussion or in the EU discussion. And what tends to happen is that 80% of the discussion and debate is going to happen overseas, and that by the time it sort of migrates back into the domestic debate here, a lot of things have already been decided to some degree. So if you're not involved in that EU global policy discussion, you're sort of shut out to some degree of some of the policy development. So with that, we, starting in 2011, 2012, we meet extensively with the EU, with IOSCO, Financial Stability Board, UK. And I would say since 2017, I don't think there's ever been a meeting that we haven't had in Brussels where we are not talking about sustainable finance. So with the Sustainable Finance Directive, what the EU has done is they're hardwiring in ESG into their regulation of asset managers and then driving it down from there. And that if you're not compliant with that, you're going to be shut out of the European financial markets to a degree. The EU has just finished its taxonomy on the climate, or has approved certain sections of its taxonomy on the Climate Delegated Act. And that means that some of those regulations are going to start to be effective, or definitions will start to be effective in January. Similarly, we also have the Corporate Governance Initiative and the Sustainable Corporate Governance Directive, which have been delayed. But those are also important as well for American companies, because if you have a subsidiary operating in Europe, you're going to have to comply with that over the course of time. And that is also going to then bleed into how your parent is going to have to operate as well. Two other things I just want to raise and look forward to further discussion. One thing people should also keep an eye on, I think this is particularly important in terms of asset management. I believe the European Union view of this was they could set the global standard, right? And this was done with GDPR. And I think a lot of the policy discussion and development that we are seeing is based off of the movement of the Sustainable Finance Directive. The one thing I would raise with that is we're seeing the UK right now as a result of Brexit beginning to go in different places, right? They're looking for a little bit more of a competitive advantage. So as the US, as we are developing our rules, right, around ESG disclosures and the like, I think we also have to pay a little bit of attention as to what is going on with the UK. So we're dealing with a little bit of a different world. The other thing I would just mention is, and we can get into this a little bit too, there's also some significant differences, I think, between the US and the EU and the US and the global discussion in this respect, in that we use common language to talk about these issues. Predominantly, however, in the EU and in the global discussion, when we have those discussions and we use that language, we're talking about climate change. When we're talking about it here in the United States, yes, we're certainly dealing with climate. There's a lot that's going on. You know, our survey statistics, match up with what Doug was saying in terms of climate disclosures with companies. US, we deal a lot with social issues. And we use a very similar term set with that. So sometimes we could be talking about ESG, but we could be talking about different things or talking past each other a little bit. And that is something that I know from our vantage point, talking on both sides of the Atlantic, it can make it a little bit of a difficult situation, a difficult discussion.
Thanks, Tom. And I completely get you with the different set of language issue. It comes up on a lot of topics. With that, I'm going to turn it to Elizabeth to sort of maybe go through some of the policy issues you're following, but also sort of based on what's happening in Europe, how is your firm sort of managing some of the ESG policies and material that's coming out of Europe? And are there any differences in how your European and American divisions are operating as a result?
Thanks, John. So I think David and Tom have already covered quite a few of the core regulatory topics that are impacting us as the asset management industry. First and foremost for us, there's SFDR, so the Sustainable Finance Disclosures Regulation, the Taxonomy, that directly impact both us as entities and as asset managers, and also our products. And that's, in terms of disclosure in particular, and how we manage them. But I think in addition, also impacting us is the fact that we often talk about the EU as if it's a cohesive whole like the US, but actually that's not always the case. And we also have a number of national things that we have to comply with as well. So it's becoming a bit of a patchwork. So the French have already introduced their own standards around ESG products. The Germans are looking at doing their own things. And as Tom mentioned, obviously with the UK having left the EU, a different set of rules are going to be put in place in the UK. As David mentioned, there's also the complicating factor that us as asset managers, we also need to be very cognizant of what is impacting our clients because they reverberate on our own operations. And so particularly, the number of rules that are being put in place for pension funds, but also insurers and banks, as well as corporates. And one of the challenges, those don't always line up very well with what we're having to do at the asset management level. And so we have to be very cognizant of how we take those into account. And then underpinning all of this, I think, is access to data, which has already been mentioned. A lot of these frameworks are really very data intensive, whether it's SFDR with their 14 mandatory principal adverse impact indicators, or the taxonomy, which, I've heard some data providers talk about 6,000 different data points that are required in order to be able to assess taxonomy alignment across the board. And that's just for the bits we have today, not counting all the additional pieces that are coming down the track. So I think that across that keeps us incredibly busy trying to understand how all those different bits slot together. And it sometimes feels like we're playing three-dimensional chess. I mean, how it's impacting us, I think that there's a couple of things. So even as I said, just within EMEA, we operate as a single block, but we're seeing this patchwork of a product that we can label as sustainable in one country won't necessarily be able to be labeled as sustainable in another. So we're already seeing that fragmentation just within Europe before we even start thinking about broader. It obviously has also impacts in terms of the impact on other parts of the business, because obviously we delegate a lot of investment management to teams outside of Europe. So even though the product is based here and therefore subject to EU requirements, the team managing the money actually might be in the US or in Hong Kong or in Japan. And so this is very much bleeding into how other teams are having to think about it. And starting to think, therefore, around, how this impacts us globally, and that question of how much of this do we do purely in Europe because we have to be subject to those requirements, and how much of it do we try and do across the board because we think it makes sense. So some parts, for example, around integration of ESG risks, which is a core part of SFDR. This is something we've been doing for a long time at Invesco anyway. And so the regulation in some ways has just sort of catalyzed what we were already doing and made us go a bit faster in certain areas. But this is something that we're doing across the board, and it's not, you know, something that we're uniquely doing in Europe. Whereas there are certain elements, for example, the principal impact indicators, this is a very EU-centric, or the taxonomy, this is very EU-centric, and therefore something that we're primarily only really looking to do in Europe. And I think, you know, David already mentioned some of these frameworks like the taxonomy are very EU-centric. It's actually very hard to apply outside the EU. And this is one of the things we're grappling with, because actually we're required to report on all of our products, regardless of where those investments are. And so there's a big challenge in terms of how do we access that data where we're investing globally on behalf of our European clients, but that data will only be available in Europe. And actually in many cases, it's very hard to screen for some of this data outside of the EU.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm going to turn it to David. So I think from pretty much all our panelists and Doug, we've heard about the EU taxonomy. Again, given that we have a primarily American audience here today, can you tell us more just about what the EU taxonomy is, how did it come to be, and what we should expect going forward, and maybe how it's affecting your company specifically?
Yeah, it's a really important concept to grasp. You know, everyone's talking about taxonomy, people are talking about taxonomania, but the EU taxonomy is, like I said earlier, it's the kind of like the bedrock of the EU sustainable finance agenda. It was suggested as a sort of key component of this architecture back in 2018 to provide an answer to what seems like a simple question, but isn't. How do we know, how do investors know with confidence which economic activities are sustainable, right? With confidence, how can you actually invest unless you know that it's sustainable? So the taxonomy is primarily a classification system for those economic activities. And like any classification system, it has definitions, it has rules, and the EU taxonomy's definitions and rules basically determine which economic activities are environmentally sustainable. And, you know, it was created to address that, you know, information deficit, but also to address greenwashing so that you enable market participants to identify and invest in sustainable assets without the fear of, you know, buying things that aren't really green. And more than a classification system, it does also, you know, impose certain disclosure obligations on companies and financial market participants to fill that data gap that Elizabeth was talking about. So how does it define these sustainable activities? At the core, really, of the taxonomy is the definition of what a sustainable and economic activity is. It's got two basic criteria. It has to contribute to at least one of the 6 objectives that are listed in the taxonomy, and it has to do no significant harm to any of the other objectives, while also having minimum safeguards on things like human rights and labor standards. I won't go through the 6 objectives now. There's a wonderful Taxonomy 101 on S&P Global's website if anyone wants to read it. It's fantastic, so head there. What's happening now is that the sort of technical screening criteria that define, you know, how do you articulate those 6 objectives are being written, the thresholds of those activities are being elaborated, whether something does or does not significantly contribute to those objectives is being measured. And also the do no significant harm principle, which is really critical to understand. That's being elaborated. Each activity has got technical screening criteria to lay out the thresholds that define, you know, whether you're doing significant harm. The next steps really here are that being built out and the reporting requirements kicking in to fill that data gap. What's controversial, I suppose, now in the implementation of it is we have this framework now. It really matters what gets into it. So we're seeing a lot of controversy on, you know, whether certain thresholds are too lenient, too strict, and there's also disagreement on whether, you know, strategic energy sources, you know, like nuclear or gas should be included. And that's a debate that's raging currently. How does this all affect S&P Global? I think it affects us mostly on the kind of product innovation and design side. You know, we're innovating every day to produce the data sets, the products, the services that enable companies and clients to operate in this emerging data ecosystem. So we need to innovate new products that serve our clients. We've got a taxonomy-linked disclosure product, for example, that, you know, tries to make that a manageable process. So we're building things on the basis of the regulatory agenda in order to implement it. And another way that we're impacted is the linkage of the taxonomy to other activities, right? So at the moment, there's talk of an EU green bond standard that's linked to the taxonomy. And how do you scale a market for taxonomy linked bonds is a real important question, because if that's the definition book of what's sustainable, getting capital to be associated with is a vital part of the transition. So we're very active in discussions with policymakers about how, us as a company can provide external reviews to enable that green bond market to scale. What's possible in the short and medium term for a company like S&P Global to actually do to be a part of that ecosystem.
Thanks, David. And I just want to remind our audience, we're going to turn to questions in about 5 minutes. So please send questions via chat in YouTube or Facebook, or you can send questions via Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. With that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Elizabeth. So the NFRD, Non-Financial Reporting Directive, introduced a concept referred to double materiality. Can you tell us what this means? Also, can you tell us more about how European policymakers are thinking about materiality in general, especially in the context of sort of CSRD, which is amending the NFRD?
Indeed. So the EU has always had this approach back from when they introduced the NFRD in 2014 around what it calls double materiality. So in essence, their view is that it's not just about a company thinking about the risks and opportunities related to sustainability, but also the impact that they're having on sustainability issues. So it's often sometimes called about, sort of the inside out and outside in perspectives. And so very much wanting to see, not just focusing on, as I said, the sort of more financial materiality lens I think lots of investors have, which is how does this ultimately impact my investments, but how do those investments and those companies ultimately the impact that they have. I think we hear a lot, in terms of this double materiality, particularly in relation to the US, which I think is more firmly, sometimes they refer to it as single materiality or this financial materiality concept of, ultimately it needs to relate to the bottom line. And I think in many cases, what we actually see as investors is that, materiality is dynamic and it's a spectrum. And so I think in some cases that, these two approaches are provided as being very separate when actually they're not. And I think it's interesting. So the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, that's just been set up, and in all of their documents, they still try to sort of square that circle between these two perspectives by talking about enterprise value. And so, because I think what we see in particular is, impact and financial risk are often interrelated, that, those companies, if you think in climate change, those companies that are having the most significant impact on climate and have the highest emissions are therefore most exposed to climate transition risk. And therefore that's a risk factor. And so I think in lots of cases, we see this as a loop rather than two totally separate issues. So I think that, there's sometimes this view that what the EU is doing, which they're sort of, furthering in particular in terms of CSRD, and indeed actually want to expand beyond corporates also to the financial sector. So the EU published its new sustainable finance strategy, which was sort of following on from the work that David talked about that the high-level expert group had done some years ago. And there's a whole chapter in there around how do you embed this double materiality perspective, and they sort of put one of the issues that they want to not only champion it in Europe, but also champion it at a global level. So wanting to put it on the agenda of the FSB. And it's one of the reasons why we hear, for example, that the EU, will have regard to, for example, what the ISSB is doing, but that they need to go further because they have this more developed view of sustainability, which is taking into account this double materiality. I think it's to be seen actually how different what the EU wants to do versus what the ISSB will actually come out with in terms of their various reporting standards, and actually, are we really that far apart? Or are we using, I think Tom talked about it earlier, that sometimes we're using the same language to mean different things, or different language to mean the same thing. And I think, it'll be interesting to see actually how far apart we end up on these issues, and whether or not we're talking as if we're operating under very different concepts, but actually we're much closer in terms of what the final reporting standards will actually look like in practice.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm going to do one last question, which will go to you, Tom, before we turn it to audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, again, please ask via chat or using the hashtag BPC Live on Twitter. So Tom, last question for you for audience Q&A, and let's bring it back to the United States. Any recent developments on ESG in the US? Now moving from Europe to the US, ESG developments in the US that you're following closely, and what should we kind of expect going forward in the coming months?
Yeah, let me answer that. And I just want to also piggyback a little bit on what Elizabeth was talking about as well. So first off, we expect a flurry of activity. So while the US may have been behind to some degree, we expect at the very beginning of next year, we're going to see the SEC start to propose rules on climate disclosures, on human capital management disclosures, on greenwashing. So we're going to see, and other things, potentially other things as well. So we're going to see the SEC start to put out for public comment rule proposals, et cetera. That's probably still going to take a full year for those proposals to be finalized. So the challenge will also be how we can have some of the coordination take place as well. The first issue, one of the first issues I ever worked on when I joined the chamber back in 2008 was the convergence of global accounting standards, right? Was to marry up US GAAP with IFRS, and we didn't quite get there for a variety of different reasons. Part of it was, and this goes on to some of what Elizabeth was talking about, was that, first off, the SEC's remit is much narrower than, let's say, where the EU could be going on certain things. And by that, right, when we start to talk about certain things like materiality, there's a very specific legal definition around materiality, which goes back to Justice Thurgood Marshall's definition in the TSC Northway decision, so that words have very specific meanings when they're used in the securities context. That is important because of the litigation environment here in the United States. So there are going to be differences between the US and the EU and US and others when we start to actually come out with some of these different rules. The issue then becomes coordination. If you went back 10 plus years ago, and David probably remembers this very well, right? Gary Gensler, when he was chair of the CFTC, came up with rules around derivatives and then tried to import the US rules on the EU. That really did not go over too well, right? And there's a big blow up that happened with that. I think we're going to have to figure out a system where we could deal with cross-border flows, we could deal with cross-border issues, understanding that there are probably going to be some differences that are going to be driven by differences in legal systems. And I think that's going to be part of the challenge that we, as those who are involved in the policy debate, are going to have to get into the right place. But it's also going to be a challenge for the business community as well to try and navigate some of that.
Thanks, Tom. And actually, our first question, we got a couple questions on the issue of materiality. So thanks for setting us up for that. And I'll let Elizabeth and David chime in. So question, do you think the definition of, quote, reasonable investor, unquote, is changing in the US in light of the impact of ESG factors on companies to create long-term value? And I'm going to combine that with a second question. How are US companies supposed to address the EU's use of double materiality when US companies follow the SEC's definition of materiality? So that's an open question. I'll let anyone take it.
I might jump in first to say, far be it from me to sort of question the definition of reasonable investor. I am an investor though, and I think I'm a reasonable person. And I when I shop around for what I want to invest my money in, I'm very cognizant of the fact that, I'm going to be around 65 when a lot of these net zero pledges and a lot of the climate deadlines come due. So it's a factor in how I make decisions about where I want to invest. What is the strategy of any given company to navigate the transition risks, and that includes not transitioning as well. If you don't transition, you're going to have risks either way. They could be liability risks, they could be physical climate risks. All of that is a factor, I think, for myself and probably other people of my generation, because it's a reasonable horizon to be looking across. And the policy momentum behind solving some of these challenges, whether you believe in them or not, are going to have an impact on the economics of certain companies, the way that we do business. So is it reasonable to factor that into your analysis as an investor? For me, it makes a lot of sense. And I hope to be able to retire one day, but that's something that I do think about today.
Thank you, David. Anyone else want to take that question, or should we jump to the next question?
John, if I could just jump in on that one too. I think I think that there are a number of things we have to just think through with that as well, right? Because look, climate is a risk, right, that businesses have to address, right? And there are disclosures that we can build in with that. Again, this is one of the reasons why I raised the social issues, right? Because very often the social issues are in the eye of the beholder, right? So it's not only that we're dealing with center-left issues, but when you start to take a look at shareholder proposals in the United States, we're looking at a lot of center-right issues too, as well, right? And the SEC's legal bulletin on now having broad societal benefits come into the shareholder proposal process is actually sparking a little bit of a debate. The other thing I would say too, and this is, look, and again, I think it comes out more in the social than on the climate, but this past year, the House of Representatives passed a vote on mandatory ESG disclosures, passed by one vote, right? And there was a 2018 poll of California and New York public pension retirees, and they were asked do you care about economic return, and do you care about the public pension plan dealing with some other issues? And they centered on economic return. So I think the challenge that we all have here is when we're dealing with this in the securities realm, that we have to remember we have to deal with it within confines of definitions of language and the like. There are other issues we have to address on a broader governmental scale as well, but we have to make sure that we're doing it in the right way, because where the SEC starts, at least in the United States, where the SEC starts to migrate out of its prescribed powers, that's usually when they run into some problems. Not saying that those issues shouldn't be addressed elsewhere, they should.
Thank you, Tom. Let's go to our next question. So what are the most meaningful future measures or goals for ESG in the US and globally? And how is optimal success defined and measured? And anyone can take that.
Pretty big question.
David, I'll jump in after you.
Question, because it's very outcome based and optimal. I never like to answer questions that have to, what's the optimal X? One thing I would say, while there's a lot of progress being made in the financial markets on a lot of these issues, and finance is key to scaling up and providing for the necessary transition, there's a limit to what financial markets can do in and of themselves. A lot of the really tough decisions out there are tricky policy decisions that affect the entire economy. And one of the reasons why we haven't taken them to date is because they are very difficult and they have economic impact. And I think looking at this, to use the word, what's an optimal way of looking at this? An optimal way of looking at this is it's not just finance. You have to look at it in a holistic way. How do you enable companies, even polluting companies on the spectrum more towards the sort of darker end of this, how do you enable them to make choices that mitigate their risks and manage the risks if this is the trajectory we're going? A lot of that has to come from public-private dialogue and governments and the financial sector and industry really working together as a whole. It can't just be all in the financial sector. It has to be a team effort.
also have to remember businesses operate globally, American businesses, right? 5% of world consumers within the confines of the US border, right? So, which means that 95% of the customers of American businesses are elsewhere. The other issue as well is capital flows around the world now, right? Capital is no longer just confined to a couple of major centers. It can flow anywhere at the click of a button. So one is it's important to make sure that the global investor has the appropriate metrics to really to measure, right? Different activities and the like, but then also ensuring that the financial regulators can also coordinate as well on a cross-border basis, which I think is going to be very important. It's not only a US-EU discussion and US-EU UK, but it's also Asia. And I think we have to understand that is something we're going to have to make sure that system can operate in that global manner.
And if I can maybe just
Yeah, go ahead.
compliment that. So I mean, I totally agree with both what David and Tom said. Particularly just leading on from what Tom said, we know that where the financing actually needs to go isn't in Europe. Europe only accounts for something like 8% of global carbon emissions. And actually it's Asia and emerging markets where that capital needs to flow. So I think having a system and a regime that investors can utilize and ensure that we're not fragmenting markets, but also that we're allocating capital where it's most needed. I think the other point to build on what David was saying is that, it's not just about, we need that, partnership between financial markets and the real economy, but it's also making sure that it's sequenced properly and that we have that smooth transition. So when we look at climate scenario analysis, which is a tool that lots of us are using to try and estimate what might be the different impact if we had, and we usually talk about 3 different scenarios. So, a very smooth transition to 1.5 degrees, a disorderly transition, and then a hothouse world. And actually it's that disorderly transition, it's leaving it too late and then having to have a really, really abrupt and very steep increase in carbon prices that's going to be the most expensive. So actually thinking about how do we start moving now, not very abruptly, but gradually, so that we don't have to make very abrupt and very hard decisions further down the line when we realize how far off course we are to actually be able to achieve, net zero. So I think thinking about, let's not leave it till the very last second, because that will actually be the most destructive in terms of financial market value.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. So we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to wrap up this event. But before I do so, I want to see if there's any topic or issue someone on the panel wants to raise or bring up that was not asked about. And if not, we can just give concluding remarks, or I can give concluding remarks at the end of this event.
John, I just say you could probably have a whole nother event on what we probably didn't talk about.
That's right. So maybe let's just leave it with that, because I think BPC will likely do more events on even the issue of ESG in Europe beyond the more broader ESG events we host. So with that, I just want to thank our panelists for this wonderful discussion. We learned a lot, and apparently there's a lot more that we could have talked about. So thank you very much. I also want to thank several people that made this event possible, including Mary Margaret Holden, Dane Stangler, and our vendors. Finally, I want to thank our audience for sort of participating in this discussion. Please check out the BPC website for more material on ESG issues more broadly. And with that, I hope we can see you next time. Thank you very much.